In the darkness of Berlin nights, when the streets emptied out and thick fog settled on the wet cobblestones, nobody knew what nightmare was unfolding behind the doors of an ordinary butcher shop. A man who greeted his customers with a smile every morning. The man who sold fresh, quality meat. The man his neighbors knew as a kind and competent man. But where did that meat come from? That was the question that, when its answer was revealed, shook all of Germany to its core. Today, I want to tell you a story you might find hard to believe. A story that shows how a human can turn into a monster that doesn't even have a place in the worst nightmares. The story of Karl Denke, the man who not only killed his victims, but sold their meat. In this hour and a half, I'm taking you deep into the darkness of a cannibal's mind, to the moments when innocent victims were caught in his grasp, to the days when the truth came out and the whole city realized what meat they had eaten. Ready? It was the year 1889. In the small German town of Münsterberg, in a simple poor house, a boy was born and named Karl. Karl Graceman Denke. His family was poor. His father was a day laborer, and his mother spent all day taking care of their children. Karl was the youngest child, a skinny, quiet kid who always sat in a corner watching others. The neighbors said this kid's eyes had something strange about them. His gaze was cold, as if behind those blue eyes, something was switched off that shouldn't wake up. Karl's father was a harsh man, a man who came home drunk at night and yelled at everyone. Little Karl had seen many times how his father hit his mother, how he punished his brothers with a belt, how he unleashed his anger on everyone. There were nights Karl hid under the blanket and heard the screams and wails, and in his small mind, something was forming that years later would turn into a monster. When Karl was 8, his father was killed in a work accident. His mother, left alone with 3 kids, had to clean people's houses to make ends meet. Karl and his brothers were left alone, and in that loneliness, Karl learned things he shouldn't have. His older brother, a violent and cruel individual, started tormenting Karl. Beatings, humiliation, and worse. Karl never talked about these things, just kept it all inside. And that anger and hatred grew inside him like a cancerous tumor. At the age of 12, Karl left school and had to work. He went to a butcher shop and started working as an apprentice. That's where he first got involved with meat, blood, and cutting. His master was a man who taught Karl how to slaughter an animal, how to separate bones from meat, how to turn every part of an animal's carcass into something sellable. Karl learned this job very quickly, even better than the other apprentices. His master said, "This boy had golden hands. He could clean a carcass completely in minutes." But what no one realized was that Karl enjoyed this work. When he held the knife in his hand and started cutting, something inside him calmed down. The anger and hatred that had built up in him for years seemed to release a little with every cut of the knife. He dreamed at night that he was cutting things more than just animals. Dreams that scared him, but also felt good. At the age of 20, Karl committed his first murder. His first victim was a street woman he had followed on a foggy night. Nobody knew what happened to that woman. She just disappeared one day and was never seen again. Karl later said in his interrogations that that night was the first time he realized how much killing a human gave him a sense of power. How much, when life left someone's body and he witnessed it, he felt like years passed, and Karl managed to open his own butcher shop. A small shop in Berlin, in a neighborhood where simple, working-class people lived. He quickly attracted customers because his meat was always fresh and his prices were good. People came and bought meat from him and were satisfied, very satisfied. They even said Mr. Denke's meat had a special taste, a taste you couldn't find elsewhere. And they were right, because that meat was truly special. During these years, Karl got married. A simple, quiet woman who didn't ask many questions. They had 2 kids. And from the outside, they seemed like a completely normal family. But at night, when everyone was asleep, Karl went to the basement of his shop, a place no one was allowed to enter, and did his work there. Work that if anyone saw, they would scream in terror and go insane. The first known victim of Karl Denke was a 20-year-old girl named Greta, who worked in a textile factory. Greta was a beautiful girl with golden hair and green eyes, a girl who dreamed of a better life. She passed by Karl's shop every day, and Karl saw her. He watched her for days, memorized her walk, her smile, the sound of her laugh, and in his mind, he plotted. One spring day in 1917, Karl offered Greta a job. He said he needed an assistant to clean the shop and help during busy hours. Greta, who needed the money, accepted. She didn't know that with this acceptance, she was stepping into a death trap. The first week went well. Karl was kind, respectful to Greta, paid her on time. Greta told her mother she was happy because her new job was much better than the factory. At the second week, things changed. One night, when it was late and the shop was closed, Karl asked Greta to go to the basement and bring up a package of meat. Greta, unsuspecting, went. As she went down the stairs, a strange smell hit her, a smell like blood and rot, and something else she couldn't identify. The basement was dark. Only a weak lamp provided light. Greta was looking for the meat package when she heard footsteps from behind her. She turned and saw Karl coming towards her, but this time his face was different. There was a smile on his face that scared Greta, a cold, emotionless smile. In his hand was something that glinted in the dark. Greta asked, "Mr. Denke, what's wrong?" Karl didn't answer, just kept getting closer. Greta felt something was wrong. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. She wanted to run, but Karl was faster. "Don't be scared, little Greta," Karl said, with a voice that seemed to come from the bottom of a well. It won't hurt much. Greta screamed, but in the basement, no one heard her. She tried to escape, but Karl grabbed her, put his hand over her mouth, and pressed her against the wall. Greta fought, kicked, but Karl was strong, much stronger than he looked. The last thing Greta saw was Karl's face getting closer and closer. And then everything went dark. Karl spent that whole night in the basement. He did his work meticulously, just as he had learned over the years in the butcher trade. First, he drained the blood, then started dismembering the body. He separated every part, separated the bones from the meat, and with complete skill, turned Greta's body into pieces that resembled veal or pork. The next day, the shop was open, and people came and bought meat, as usual. Karl served them with a smile, packaged the fresh meat, and took the money. And nobody knew where the meat they were buying came from. Greta's mother, when her daughter didn't return, went to the police and reported her missing. The police investigated, asked the neighbors, inquired with Greta's co-workers. They came to Karl and asked where Greta was. Karl, with a worried face, said Greta had left the shop yesterday evening and he didn't know where she went. He said maybe she found a new boyfriend and ran off with him. The police took notes and left, and Karl smiled. This was the beginning, but not the end. Over the following years, other girls and women disappeared. They all had one thing in common. They had all, at some point in their lives, encountered Karl Denke. The second victim was a girl named Anna, a country girl who had come to Berlin to find work. Karl had seen her at a bus stop, alone and lost. He approached her and offered help, said he could give her a place to sleep and food. Anna, who had nowhere to go, agreed. The first night, Karl took Anna to a room above the shop, a place previously used for storage. He told her work would start tomorrow morning, and she should rest. Anna was happy and thought she was lucky. But the second night, Karl came to her room. He opened the door and entered. Anna woke up and saw him standing there. And in his eyes, she saw something that made her blood run cold. "Please," Anna said with a trembling voice. "What do you want?" Karl answered, "What I've always wanted. Power." Anna realized she couldn't escape. The door was locked. The window had bars, and Karl was standing between her and the only way out. She begged, cried, promised she would never tell anyone anything if he let her go. But Karl just moved closer and did the same thing he had done to Greta. And once again, a young girl disappeared. And once again, Karl's shop was filled with fresh meat. The third was Martha, a 30-year-old woman who had recently lost her husband. Karl had seen her in a church, praying and crying. After the service, he approached her and offered condolences. They started talking, and Karl presented himself as a kind and caring man. Martha, lonely and sad, needed this attention. Karl invited Martha to his shop, said he wanted to cook dinner for her, a good dinner to cheer her up. Martha agreed and came to the shop on Friday night. Karl had prepared a nice dinner with wine, candles, and everything. They ate and talked, and Martha laughed for the first time since her husband's death. Karl made her comfortable, listened to her, and when he saw Martha trusted him completely, he put something in her wine. After a few minutes, Martha felt dizzy, said she wasn't feeling well. Karl helped her up and said but this time, something happened that Karl didn't expect. Martha suddenly woke up right at the moment Karl had raised the knife. She screamed and grabbed Karl's hand, tried to wrestle the knife from him. They struggled. Martha fought with all her strength for her life. Karl yelled, "Shut up! Shut up, you idiot!" But Martha screamed, "Help! Somebody help! He's a murderer!" Karl put his hand over Martha's mouth and with all his force threw her to the ground. Martha's head hit the corner of a table and a loud thud was heard. Martha lay motionless, blood flowing from her head. Karl stood there panting for a few moments, looking at her, then picked up the knife and finished his work. The police investigated Martha's disappearance too, but again found no clues. Karl, this time, said he didn't know Martha at all, and no one could prove he was lying. During the years of World War I, the situation got better for Karl. Meat was scarce, people were hungry, and anyone who had meat could sell it for a good price. Karl took advantage of this situation. He hunted more, killed more, and sold more. Homeless women, street women, lonely women nobody was looking for. They were all Karl's targets. One of his victims was a girl named Lisa, who was a runaway from home. Lisa was only 16, a girl who had run away from her addict father and was wandering the streets of Berlin. Karl found her one cold winter night, sitting under a bridge, shivering from the cold. Karl approached her and said, "My girl, you're freezing here. Come with me, I have a warm place." Lisa looked at him with eyes full of fear and hope. She didn't know whether to be scared or hopeful. The cold was worse than her fear, so she took Karl's hand. Karl took her to the shop, gave her warm food, wrapped a blanket around her. Lisa thought maybe an angel had found her. Maybe God had heard her prayers. But what she didn't know was that the devil sometimes takes the form of an angel. The first night, Karl didn't touch Lisa, just let her sleep. The second night was the same. Lisa started to feel safe. But the third night, Karl came to her room, and this time, he didn't intend to sleep. When Lisa realized what he intended, she started to beg, "Please, I'm just a kid. Don't do anything to me." Karl said in a cold voice, "You're not a kid anymore. You're meat. Good, fresh meat." Lisa screamed, but Karl covered her mouth. And then the same thing happened that had happened to the others. The next day, Karl's shop was open, and his customers bought fresh meat and left. Years passed, and Karl continued his work. He now had a complete technique, knew how to choose victims, Ulrike was the daughter of a local politician, a mischievous and rebellious girl who was tired of her family's luxurious life and wanted to experience something different. She sometimes wore simple clothes and went to poor neighborhoods just to see how people lived there. Karl saw her one afternoon near his shop. Ulrike was looking in the window, and Karl noticed her from inside the shop. His eyes lit up. This girl was different. You could tell from her mannerisms that she was from the upper class, even if she was dressed simply. And Karl always loved to experience new challenges. He came out of the shop and said with a smile, "Young lady, looking for something special?" Ulrike turned and looked at him. She was 16, with dark brown hair and blue eyes. A beautiful girl who didn't yet know how terrible the world could be. "No, just looking," Ulrike replied. Karl said, "If you'd like, you can come in. I have hot tea. It's cold out." Ulrike, curious, agreed and went inside. They started talking, and Karl realized this girl was from a wealthy family. He was cautious. He didn't want to rush and make a mistake. This one he had to take more carefully. Over the next few weeks, Ulrike came to Karl's shop many times. She had developed an interest in Karl. Not a romantic interest, but a kind of curiosity about this simple man who owned a butcher shop. Karl played his part well, presenting himself as a kind, fatherly man. One day, Ulrike said to Karl, "I want to do a charitable act. I want to help poor people. Can I work here and help you a bit so I can understand how ordinary people live?" Karl smiled, a smile that if Ulrike had understood its meaning, she would have run away immediately. He said, "Of course, young lady, I'd be happy to." Ulrike went home and told her family she wanted to work in a shop to gain experience. Her father, who wanted his daughter to learn responsibility, agreed, but said one of the family's bodyguards had to take her and pick her up every day. This created a problem for Karl. He couldn't take Ulrike the way he had taken the others. The bodyguard was always waiting, and if Ulrike disappeared, serious investigations would start immediately. So Karl waited. He waited for the right opportunity. And one day, the opportunity came. Ulrike told Karl she wanted to stay late on Friday night because she wanted to learn how to prepare the meat for the next day. She told her bodyguard to leave and come back at 10 p.m. The bodyguard hesitated, but Ulrike insisted, and he had to agree. Karl and Ulrike were left alone. Karl took her to the basement to show her how they stored the meat. Ulrike went down, and when she entered the basement, she smelled a strange odor. "What's that smell?" she asked. Karl, who was behind her, said, "The smell of blood and fresh meat. It's normal." But Ulrike felt something wasn't right. She turned and looked at Karl, and for the first time, she truly saw him. There was something in Karl's eyes that frightened her. Ulrike tried to get past him, but Karl grabbed her. She started to scream, and unlike the other victims, her voice was loud, very loud. Put his hand over her mouth and said, "Be quiet, or it'll get worse." Ulrike used this opportunity and ran towards the stairs. She was almost at the door when Karl grabbed her from behind and slammed her to the ground. They struggled. Ulrike scratched Karl's face with her nails, defended herself with all her strength. But Karl was stronger. He wrapped his hands around Ulrike's neck and started squeezing. Ulrike couldn't breathe. She wrapped her hands around Karl's arms and tried to pry them open, but she couldn't. Her eyes were darkening. She could hear Lace. One of them said, "Can we see the basement too?" Karl's heart sank that he kept his composure. Karl knew he couldn't say no. He opened the refrigerator, and there, among pieces of beef and mutton, was Ulrike's body, still not dismembered. The policeman didn't realize at first because the light was dim and everything looked like meat. But one of them saw something that caught his attention. A hand, a human hand, with painted nails. He yelled, "What is this?" Karl wanted to run, but the other policeman blocked him. They arrested him, and when they fully examined the refrigerator, they realized what horrible thing they had discovered. News of Karl Denke's arrest spread through Berlin like wildfire. Newspapers printed horrifying headlines. "Cannibal butcher arrested." "The monster of Berlin behind bars." "Butcher shop that sold human flesh." People couldn't believe what the man they had bought meat from for years had actually sold them. The night of Karl's arrest, police turned his shop and house upside down. What they found was beyond the worst nightmares. In the basement, besides Ulrike's body, they found the remains of at least 3 other bodies. Bones that had been meticulously cleaned. Pieces of human tissue stored in various containers. And a notebook in which Karl had written his notes. Detective Muller, now in charge of the case, read that notebook, and the hair on his neck stood on end. In that notebook, Karl had written in precise detail how he had hunted each victim, how he had killed them, and how he had dismembered their bodies. He had even noted which parts of the body were better for sale, which parts tasted better. On one page, Karl had written, "Sold Greta today. Customers said the meat was very tender and delicious. Need to find more of this type." On another page, he had written, "Mixed Anna with pork. No one noticed the difference." And on another, "Martha was tougher. Needs to be cooked more." Mueller felt nauseous. He said to his colleague, "This is no longer human. This is a monster." Karl's house was also searched. His wife and children, who had known nothing until that moment, were shocked. His wife, a simple woman named Helga, cried and said, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." The police interrogated her, but it was clear she really didn't know anything. Karl had led a double life, an ordinary man at home and a killer in the shop. His children, 2 teenage boys, also knew nothing. As the investigation continued, police began reviewing missing persons cases from recent years in Berlin. They discovered that at least 20 young women and girls had disappeared in the same neighborhood, and they all had one thing in common. They had all been seen near Karl's shop on the last day they were seen. Police began digging in the backyard of the shop and in the basement floor. They found more bones, human remains that had been buried there for years. Forensic experts said the bones belonged to at least 15 different people. The city of Berlin was in shock. People who had bought meat from Karl for years were now terrified that they might have unintentionally eaten human flesh. Some got sick, some went crazy at the thought of what they had done. A woman named Franziska committed suicide because she couldn't live with the thought that she might have eaten her friend. Karl was transferred to prison, where he awaited interrogation. He was kept in solitary confinement because the police were afraid other inmates would kill him. News of Karl's deeds had reached the prison too, and everyone hated him. The first night in prison, Karl didn't sleep. He lay on his bed looking at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he felt fear. Not fear of punishment, but fear that he could no longer be in control, could no longer hunt, could no longer experience that feeling of power. The next morning, Detective Mueller came for the first interrogation. He entered the room and saw Karl sitting at the table, his hands handcuffed. Mueller sat down and looked at Karl for a while without saying anything. Karl broke the silence. "What do you want to know?" Mueller said. "Everything. Start from the beginning." Karl smiled, a cold, empty smile. "From where? From when I was a kid and my father beat me? Or from when my brother did things to me he shouldn't have? Or from the first time I took a life and found out what it feels like?" Mueller put his hand on the table. "I want to know the names of all the victims. I want to know how many there were, who they were, how you killed them." Karl leaned back in his chair. "Why? What difference does it make? They're dead. It's over. It makes a difference to their families. They have a right to know." Karl thought for a moment, then said, "Okay, I'll tell you, but you have to give me something." "What?" "Cigarettes. I want cigarettes." Mueller took a pack of cigarettes from his pocket and put it on the table. Karl took one, lit it, and took a deep drag. The first one was a street woman, 1910. I don't remember her name. The second one was the same. But from the third one on, I wrote down their names. He began to tell. Names, dates, details. Mueller wrote everything down, and with every name Karl said, his heart ached more. These weren't just names, these were real lives. Humans who had families, friends, dreams. Mueller asked, "Why? Why did you do this?" Karl looked at him, a long, heavy look. "You can't understand. When I killed someone, I felt alive. Only then did I really feel I existed. The rest of the time, I was just a shadow, an empty thing. But when life left someone's body and I witnessed it, in that moment, I was God." "You're not God. You're a mentally ill murderer." Karl laughed. "Maybe, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed every moment of it. Mueller felt he couldn't stay in that room any longer. He stood up and said, "I'll be back tomorrow. You have to tell everything. Show us everywhere you buried the bodies." Karl nodded. Sure. The interrogations continued, day by day, week by week. Karl told everything, in complete detail, sometimes even with pleasure. It was as if he was talking about a pleasant trip, not about the horrible murders he had committed. One of the most horrifying moments of the interrogation was when Karl talked about how he dismembered the bodies and prepared them for sale. He said, "I had learned which part of the human body resembles which part of an animal's body. For example, the thigh of a young human is very similar to veal shank. If you clean it properly and remove the bone, no one can tell the difference." Mueller asked, "Did you never feel guilty when you saw people buying this meat and taking it home, cooking it for their children? Did you never think about what you were doing?" Karl paused for a moment, as if he was really thinking. Then he said, "No, I only thought about how clever I was to have fooled everyone. Do you know how many people bought meat from me every day? 20, 30 people, and none of them suspected. That gave me a sense of power. And that notebook, why did you write everything down?" "Because I didn't want to forget. Each one of them was special to me. Each one was a story. I wanted to be able to read it later and remember." Mueller felt he was looking at a real monster, something that had the shape of a human, but was empty inside of everything we call human. In one interrogation session, Mueller put a photo of Ulrike in front of Karl. "Do you know this girl?" Karl looked at the photo and nodded. "Yes, Ulrike. Why did you kill her?" "Because the opportunity came up. She was there, alone, and I couldn't control the temptation. You knew she was from an important family. You knew they would look for her. Why did you take the risk?" Karl smiled. "That risk was what made it exciting. I was tired of easy hunts. I wanted something more challenging." Mueller slammed his fist on the table. "She was a human, not prey. A 16-year-old girl who still had her whole life ahead of her." Karl looked into Mueller's eyes, a cold, empty look. To me, it made no difference. They were all the same. After weeks of interrogation, the police were able to compile a complete list of Karl's victims. The official count was announced as 23. But Karl hinted there might be more, because early on, he didn't write everything down. The victims' families, one by one, heard the news. Greta's mother, when she found out what had happened to her daughter, had a heart attack and was hospitalized. Anna's father, a man who had searched for his daughter for years, when he found out she had been killed and her body turned into meat, threw himself out of a window and died. This tragedy wasn't limited to the direct victims. It damaged the entire community. People who had bought meat from Karl now struggled with feelings of guilt and horror. Some could no longer eat meat. Some went to psychiatrists. Some left their families and moved away because they couldn't cope with this reality. One of Karl's regular customers, a man named Otto, who had bought meat from Karl every week for years, said in a newspaper interview, "I bought meat from that shop every week for my family. My wife and kids ate it and said how delicious it was. Now, when I think about what we might have eaten, I go crazy. I can't look my children in the eye anymore. Karl's neighbors were also shocked. A woman who had a tailor shop next to Karl's shop said, "He was always kind, always said hello, sometimes gave me meat as a gift. I thought I had a good neighbor. Now when I think about what those gifts were, I want to die." Newspapers printed something new about Karl every day. One of them consulted psychologists to understand how a human could turn into such a monster. Dr. Friedrich Weiss, a famous Berlin psychologist, wrote in an article, "Karl Denke is a perfect example of a psychopath who has no empathy. He suffers from severe antisocial personality disorder, and the abuse he experienced in childhood caused his brain to develop in an abnormal way." But for ordinary people, these explanations weren't enough. They just wanted to know how someone could do such things and sleep soundly at night. In one interrogation, Mueller asked Karl, "How did you sleep at night? Didn't you have nightmares?" Karl replied, "No, I had the best sleeps, good sleeps, no nightmares. Why should I have nightmares? I was doing what I loved." "And your family? Your wife? Your children? Did you never think about what would happen to them if they found out?" For the first time, Karl's face changed. A shadow of something like sadness appeared in his eyes. Helga and the kids. Yeah, they were the only thing that mattered to me. But I couldn't control myself. What was inside me was stronger than anything. "So you knew what you were doing was wrong?" "No, I didn't know it was wrong. I only knew that others thought it was wrong. For me, it was natural." Karl's wife, Helga, never visited him. She and their children changed their names and left Berlin, hoping to start a new life, away from the shadow of this tragedy. But the shadow was always with them. Karl's sons, now teenagers, would struggle with the reality that their father was a cannibalistic murderer for the rest of their lives. The older one, Johann, said years later in an interview, "I remember my father as a kind man. He read me stories at night, helped me with my homework, played with me. How could the same man, the same father, have done those things? I will never be able to answer that question for the rest of my life." In the last interrogation session, Mueller asked Karl, "If you could go back in time, would you do the same things again?" Karl thought for a while, then said, "I don't know. Maybe I'd be more careful not to get caught, but I wouldn't stop it. I couldn't." Even if you knew the result would be you sitting here waiting for execution. Even then, because those moments, that feeling I had, was worth everything. Mueller closed the file and stood up. "You really are a monster, Karl Denke, and I'm glad you can never hurt anyone again." Karl smiled, that same cold, empty smile. "But I will remain in everyone's minds forever. Everyone who hears this story will never forget it. In that way, I have become immortal." And he was right. The name Karl Denke became a symbol of the worst a human can be. The case of Karl Denke went to court, and all of Germany waited to see what fate awaited this monster. The trial was held in one of Berlin's largest halls, because the number of journalists, victims' families, and ordinary people who wanted to witness it was so great. On the first day of the trial, Karl was brought from prison in a police car. When they took him out of the car, the crowd gathered outside the courthouse began shouting and cursing. Someone threw a stone that hit the car window and shattered it. Police had to shield Karl to get him inside. Inside the courtroom, Karl was seated at the defendant's table. He was calm, his face neutral, as if he was attending a regular meeting, not a murder trial. He looked around at the victims' families, staring at him with hate-filled eyes, at the journalists busy writing and taking pictures, at the judge sitting behind his desk with a stony face. The judge, an elderly man named Dr. Heinrich Schmidt, opened the session. He said, "We are gathered here today to judge one of the most horrific crimes in German history. The accused, Karl Denke, is charged with the murder of 23 people, dismembering their bodies and selling human flesh." When these words were spoken, moans and cries rose from the victims' families. One woman stood up and shouted, "Murderer, monster, you killed my daughter." The judge banged his gavel and said, "Please maintain order or I will have to clear the courtroom." The prosecutor, a young, energetic man named Klaus Richter, stood up and began reading the indictment. In a loud, clear voice, he read the names of the victims one by one, and with each name spoken, he looked at Karl's face to see if he would react. Greta Schultz, 20 years old, killed in 1917. Anna Müller, 19 years old, killed the same year. Martha Weiss, 30 years old, killed in 1918. Lisa Hoffman, 16 years old, killed in 1919. The list continued, and with each name, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. These weren't just names. These were lives that had been extinguished, futures that never came to be. When the prosecutor finished, he looked at Karl and asked, "Mr. Denke, do you plead guilty to these charges?" Karl slowly stood up. He looked at the victims' families, then at the judge, and said, "Yes, I plead guilty to all of them." A murmur spread through the room. Some had expected Karl to deny it, or at least try to justify himself. But without any hesitation, he admitted his guilt. The prosecutor said, "You know that your confession can lead to a death sentence." Karl nodded. "Yes, I know." "And you still confess?" "Yes." The judge ordered Karl's defense attorney to speak. The attorney, he looked at Karl with concern, because he knew defending such a client was impossible. Braun said, "Your Honor, I ask you to consider my client's mental state. We have medical evidence showing that Mr. Denke suffers from severe psychological disorders. He was abused in his childhood, and these traumas caused his brain to develop abnormally." The prosecutor immediately objected. "Your Honor, mental illness is no excuse for murdering 23 people. This man committed these crimes with planning and full awareness. He even kept a notebook." The judge said, "Objection sustained, Mr. Braun. Mental illness can be a mitigating circumstance, but in this case, the severity of the crimes is so great that it cannot be justified. Braun tried to defend Karl with various arguments, but everyone knew this effort was futile. Even Karl himself had no interest in being defended. He just sat there, looking indifferent to everything. On the second day of the trial, witnesses began testifying. Detective Mueller was the first witness. He explained how they had arrested Karl, what they had found in his shop and house, and what Karl had said during interrogations. When Mueller talked about Karl's notebooks and read a few pages aloud, some people in the room felt nauseous and had to leave. After Mueller, the forensic pathologist came and explained how the bodies had been dismembered, how meticulously the bones had been separated from the flesh. He said, "This work requires special skill that only a professional butcher has, and the accused had exactly that skill." One of the victim's family members, Greta's father, asked the judge for permission to speak. He was an old man with white hair and eyes tired from crying. He stepped forward and looked at Karl. "You killed my daughter," he said in a trembling voice. "My daughter, who had done nothing to you. She was a good girl, kind, with many dreams. You not only took her life, but you also dismembered her body." And his voice broke and he couldn't continue. Karl looked at him, and for the first time, something resembling regret was seen in his eyes. He said quietly, "I'm sorry." Greta's father shouted, "Sorry? Sorry isn't enough. You must die. You must die the same way you killed them." The judge banged his gavel, and guards calmed Greta's father and returned him to his seat. The trial lasted 3 days. Testimonies, evidence, photographs. Everything was presented. In the end, Judge Schmidt announced he would deliver the sentence the next day. On the last night before the sentencing, Karl sat in his cell, staring at the wall. A prison guard named Eric asked him, "Are you scared?" Karl shook his head. "No, I have nothing left to be scared of." "Aren't you scared of death?" "What is death? Just the end of something. I've been around death all my life. I'm not scared of it anymore." Eric looked at him. "You really don't understand what you did, do you? You don't understand how much pain and suffering you caused." Karl thought for a moment. "I understand that I caused pain, but what about my pain? Who cared about my pain? When my father beat me, when my brother did those things to me, who came to my rescue? So this was your revenge on society?" "No, it was just something I could do to feel alive." The next day, the courtroom was full again. Everyone waited for Judge Schmidt to announce his sentence. He entered. Everyone stood. Then he sat down and began reading the verdict. After reviewing all the evidence and testimonies, this court has concluded that Karl Denke has committed the worst crimes this country has ever seen. He not only killed 23 innocent humans, but also desecrated their bodies and sold their flesh. These crimes are beyond any description. The judge looked at Karl. You have shown no sign of genuine remorse. You are only sorry you got caught, not for what you did." Karl said nothing, just looked at the judge. "Therefore, this court sentences you to death by guillotine. The sentence will be carried out within 30 days. The sound of applause and crying filled the room. The victims' families cried in each other's arms, some from happiness that justice was served, some from grief for loved ones who would never return. Karl showed no reaction. He just stood, bowed his head, and allowed the guards to take him away. 30 days after the verdict was issued, the day of execution arrived. The night before the execution, Karl was in his cell, and a priest came to speak with him. The priest, an elderly man named Father Johannes, had been speaking with death row inmates for years, but he had never seen anyone like Karl. Father Johannes asked, "My son, do you want to confess? Do you want God to forgive you?" Karl, sitting on his bed, looked at him. "I have nothing to confess that I haven't already said. And God, if God existed, why did he let me be born into this world? Why did he let those things happen to me in my childhood?" Father Johannes took a deep breath. "God has given us free will. Humans choose what to do. Then I made my choice, and now I'm paying the price. You still have time to repent, to find peace before death." Karl smiled, a bitter smile. "I only experienced peace once, when I was hunting." Father Johannes sat with Karl until morning, tried to talk to him, but Karl didn't change. He remained as he was, a man empty of emotion, a man who neither repented nor was afraid. On the morning of the execution, the weather was cloudy. A light rain was falling, and the air was cold. Karl was taken from his cell and led to the execution site. In the same prison, in the back courtyard, the guillotine was ready. Only a few officials and victims. Families were permitted to witness the execution. They stood, some with hard faces, some with tears in their eyes. They led Karl toward the guillotine. He looked around, at the cloudy sky, at the faces of those who had come to see him die. He showed no sign of fear. The prison warden, who was responsible for carrying out the sentence, asked, "What are your last words?" Karl paused, then said, "I'm sorry I couldn't control myself, but I'm not sorry I did those things. They were a part of me, and I couldn't live without them." One of the family members, Lisa's mother, shouted, "You're a monster, a monster." Karl looked at her. "I know, and now this monster is being destroyed." They placed Karl on the board, positioned his head under the blade. He closed his eyes, and for the last time, took a deep breath. The blade fell, and it was all over. Karl Denke's body was buried the same day, in an unmarked grave. The law did not allow his family to claim the body, because they feared his burial site might become a shrine that some disturbed individuals might venerate. News of Karl's execution spread everywhere. Newspapers wrote with big headlines, "Justice served. The monster of Berlin is dead. The end of a nightmare." People felt relieved, felt that they were safer now. But for the victims' families, Karl's death was not the end of their pain. They still went to sleep with nightmares every night, still lived every day with the grief of their lost loved ones. Greta's mother, who had survived her heart attack, died a year after Karl's execution. Doctors said her heart couldn't take it anymore. But those who knew her understood that she died of grief, not illness. Ulrike's father, the politician who had lost his daughter, retired from politics and spent the rest of his life in a small house on the outskirts of the city. He never remarried and kept a photo of his daughter with him until the end of his life. Anna's brother, the only surviving member of his family, immigrated to America to escape these memories. But even there, in that distant land, the nightmares didn't leave him. Karl's shop was closed after his arrest, and no one was willing to buy or rent that property. It stood empty for years, until finally the city council decided to demolish the building. They destroyed Karl's old neighbors. Those who had lived next to him for years couldn't stay in that neighborhood. Some moved away, some stayed, but things were never the same again. That neighborhood was forever marked by the name Karl Denke. And when people spoke of that area, they would say in a quiet voice, "There, where that murderer lived." Detective Mueller, who years after his retirement participated in an interview, said, "I saw many crimes in my career, but none as horrific as the Karl Denke case. What bothered me the most was that he wasn't remorseful. Even at the last moment, even when he was dying, he showed no sign of remorse. That's something I can't forget." Years later, psychologists and criminologists studied the Karl Denke case, trying to understand how a human could turn into such a monster. They wrote about the abuse in his childhood, about the traumas he had experienced, about his psychological disorders. None of these explanations could truly answer why. Why him? Why at that time? Why in that horrific way? Some questions have no answers, and perhaps it's better that they don't. One of Karl's victims who survived was a girl named Sophie. She had been lucky because on the night Karl intended to kill her, the police had come to investigate a neighbor's complaint and saved Sophie. Sophie, who was 18 at the time, lived in fear and terror for the rest of her life. In an interview she gave years later, she said, "I dream every night that I'm escaping from that basement. Every night I see his face, that cold smile, those empty eyes. I was saved, but I never truly became free. A part of me always remained in that dark basement." The story of Karl Denke became an urban legend, something mothers told their children to scare them into not staying out late at night. If you come home late, the cannibal will get you. But the truth was that Karl Denke wasn't a legend. He was real. His crimes were real. And his victims were real people who had lives, dreams, and futures. In later years, several other people claimed that they too had bought meat from Karl and had now become ill. Some of these claims were real, Some were just trying to financially exploit the tragedy. The German government was forced to create a compensation fund for the indirect victims of this crime, for those who couldn't work, for psychological reasons, for families who needed financial help. One of the strange aspects of this case was that Karl's wife, Helga, insisted until the end of her life that she had known nothing. She said, "Karl was two people. The man I knew was a good husband and a kind father. That other man, psychologists confirmed this. They said that Karl did not have multiple personality disorder, but had a very high ability to hide his true self. He could be a normal man at home and a killer in the shop." Karl's sons, who had changed their names, never married. They were afraid that they might pass their father's genes to their children, afraid that they too might become monsters. This fear was irrational, but for them, it was real. One of them wrote in a letter years later, "I look in the mirror every day, and I'm afraid I'll see my father's face. Every time I get angry, I'm afraid that maybe the monster inside me will wake up. This isn't living. It's just a kind of survival." After Karl's execution, the police and prosecution began a more thorough review of missing persons cases from the previous decade. They wanted to make sure all of Karl's victims had been identified and no family was left without answers. A special team was formed under Detective Miller's leadership. They reviewed all the cases of young women and girls who had disappeared in Berlin and its suburbs. The number of cases was horrifying, over 100 unsolved disappearances. The team began comparing these cases with Karl's notes, with possible dates, with possible locations. It was difficult and exhausting work because Karl hadn't written everything down, and some of his notes were vague. In one note, Karl had written, "That girl with red hair, the one who was crying." But no name, no date, nothing specific. The team had to review all the cases of red-haired girls and eventually found 3 possible matches. They could never be sure which one was the actual victim. Mueller said in one team meeting, "This is unbearable. We have to give these families answers. But how? How do we tell them that maybe their loved one was Karl's victim, but we're not sure?" One of his colleagues, a female detective named Ingrid, said, "We have to be honest. It's better for them to live with doubt than with a lie." So they began contacting the families. One by one, they went to the homes of people who had been waiting for news of their loved ones for years, and told them that perhaps, just perhaps, their loved one had been a victim of Karl Denke. The reactions varied. Some families felt relieved because at least they now knew what had happened, even if it was horrific. But others became angry, thinking the police were lying to them, trying to close an unsolved case. One of these families was the family of a girl named Clara, who had disappeared 3 years earlier. Clara's mother, when the police told her that her daughter might have been Karl's victim, screamed, "No, not my daughter. You're lying. My Clara is alive. She's just missing. She'll come back." Mueller tried to calm her. "Mrs. Schmidt, I understand it's hard, but we have to be realistic. But Clara's mother refused to believe it. She waited for her daughter's return until the end of her life, looking out the window every day, hoping Clara would appear from the street and come home. The investigative team also began examining whether Karl might have had an accomplice. They interrogated everyone who had been in contact with Karl: slaughterhouse workers from whom he bought meat, local market vendors, even his regular customers. One customer, a man named Herman, who owned a small restaurant, said during interrogation, "I bought meat from Karl every week. ... My restaurant was famous for its good meat. Now when I think about what I served, I want to kill myself." Mueller asked, "Did you never suspect that those meats were strange?" Herman shook his head. "No, never. They were excellent, the best meat I'd ever seen. Their taste was a bit different, but I thought it was because of Karl's special preparation technique." Herman's restaurant went bankrupt after the story broke. People were no longer willing to eat at a place that might have served human flesh. Herman hanged himself with a rope 2 months later, in the same restaurant that had once been his pride. During further investigations, police discovered that Karl sometimes traveled to towns around Berlin. Did he also hunt during those trips? The investigative team began reviewing missing persons cases in the surrounding towns. And what they found was horrifying. In 3 different towns, during time periods when Karl was likely there, young girls had disappeared. Mueller went to the local authorities in those towns and spoke with them about these cases. One local detective, a man named Otto, said, "We had a case, a girl named Hilda who disappeared 3 years ago. She was last seen talking to a man who had a van, but we never found that man." Mueller showed a photo of Karl. Was it this man? Otto looked at the photo, his eyes widening. Could be. Looks a lot like the description the witness gave. They opened Hilda's case file and compared it with the details they had from Karl's victim cases. There were many similarities: age, appearance, method of disappearance. They were almost certain Hilda had also been Karl's victim. Ultimately, after months of investigation, Mueller's team concluded that Karl had probably killed between 30 and 40 people, not just the 23 officially confirmed, but they could never identify all of them. Mueller wrote in his final report, "Karl Grossmann Denke was one of the most dangerous serial killers in German history. He operated with precision, coldness, and complete ruthlessness. The true number of his victims will probably never be known. This case is a bitter reminder of how a human can turn into a monster, and how society may not notice for years. One question everyone asked was, how was Karl able to continue his work for so many years without getting caught? Why did no one suspect? The answer was complex. First, Karl was vigilant. He carefully selected his victims: lonely women, homeless people, those who wouldn't be searched for if they disappeared. He knew the police had limited resources and couldn't investigate every case. Second, he had good techniques for hiding his crimes. Dismembering the bodies and mixing them with animal meat was a method that was very hard to detect, especially at a time when forensic technology wasn't advanced. Third, and perhaps most importantly, no one could believe it. The human mind cannot easily accept such a horrific thing. When neighbors looked at Karl, they saw an ordinary butcher, not a cannibalistic killer. And that's exactly what allowed Karl to continue his work for years. A psychologist named Dr. Erich Fromm wrote in an article about this case, "Humans like to think they can recognize monsters. But the reality is that the most dangerous monsters are those who resemble us, those who can blend into society and no one notices." The Karl Denke case also brought changes to the German police system. They formed a special department for reviewing missing persons cases, created a central database where all cases were registered, and improved the cooperation system between different cities. But all these changes came too late. For Karl's victims, for their families, for all those whose lives were forever changed, it no longer mattered. Years after Karl's execution, a young journalist named Martin Kramer decided to produce a comprehensive documentary about this case. He wanted to go beyond the newspaper headlines. He wanted to speak with those who were truly involved in this story. Martin began contacting survivors of the victims, people who had known Karl, police officers who had worked on the case. Some agreed to speak. Some refused, saying they didn't want to return to those dark days. One of the first people Martin interviewed was Detective Mueller, who was now retired and living in a small house on the outskirts of Berlin. Mueller was now a 70-year-old man with white hair and eyes that still held the shadow of those days. Martin asked, "Mr. Mueller, you worked on murder cases for years. What made the Karl Denke case different?" That's something I'll never forget. What do you think caused him to become this way? Mueller looked out the window at his small garden, coming to life with spring flowers. His bad childhood, the abuse he endured, poverty, violence, all of that contributed. But you know what? I've seen many people who had the same conditions but didn't become killers. So something else was at work, something I can't explain. Maybe some people are born evil. One of them was Greta's sister, a 60-year-old woman named Elsa, who is now a mother of 3 and grandmother of 5. Elsa said in a trembling voice, "Greta was my big sister, the best sister anyone could have. She took care of me, taught me lessons, played with me. When she disappeared, I was only 12. I waited for her to come back, looked at the door every day. But she never returned." Tears streamed down her cheeks. When we found out what happened to her, I went crazy. I couldn't believe that my Greta, my beautiful sister, was killed that way. And then we found out that her voice broke and she couldn't continue. Martin waited for her to calm down, then asked, "How were you able to live with this reality?" Elsa took a tissue and wiped her eyes. "Well, life goes on, right? I got married, had children, tried to have a normal life. But Greta was always with me, in my thoughts, in my dreams. There wasn't a day I didn't remember her. Did you witness Karl's execution? Yes, I was there. I wanted to make sure he was really dead, that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. How did it feel? Elsa paused, as if returning to that moment, an empty feeling. I thought when I saw him die, I would feel satisfaction, feel that justice had been served. But no, I just felt empty, because his death didn't bring Greta back. Martin also managed to speak with Sophie, the only surviving victim who had escaped from Karl. Sophie was now a 50-year-old woman, never married and living alone. She said, "I have the same nightmare every night. I see myself in that dark basement, Karl approaching, and I can't escape. After all these years, I still feel that fear. Why do you think you survived, but others didn't?" Sophie shook her head slowly. "Luck. Just luck. The police happened to come that night. If they had come 5 minutes later, I would have been like the others. That's something I live with every day. Guilt. Feeling why I survived, and they didn't." "Did you see Karl in court?" "Yes, from a distance. I couldn't get close. I couldn't look at him. I just saw him, and that feeling of terror returned." "Did he look at you?" Sophie shuddered. "Yes. For a moment, his eyes locked with mine, and I saw nothing. There was nothing in his eyes. It was like looking into the eyes of a corpse. Something lifeless." Martin then sought out people who had worked with Karl. One of them was an old man named Gunther, who had been Karl's apprentice years before. Gunther said, "I learned butchery from Karl. He was a good teacher, patient, precise. I never thought he was doing those things." "Did you ever see anything strange?" "No, nothing. Everything was normal. Only once. Once I went to the basement without telling him, and he got very angry. He said never to go there, without permission again. At the time, I thought he was just a protective craftsman. But now that I think about it, what do you think he was doing then?" Gunther looked at the ground. "I don't know, and I don't want to know." Martin also spoke with the forensic pathologist who had examined the bodies. Dr. Wolfgang, now retired, said, "I've seen many corpses in my work, but what I saw in Karl's basement was beyond anything. The method of dismembering the bodies, the precision in separating the bones, everything showed this work was done by a professional. If I didn't know these were human corpses, I would have thought they were animal carcasses. How were you able to return to normal life after seeing those scenes?" Dr. Wolfgang gave a bitter smile. "I didn't. After that case, I went to a psychiatrist. For a while, I had horrible nightmares. Even now, after all these years, I sometimes wake up at night and see those scenes." Finally, Martin managed to speak with one of Karl's sons. He only agreed to the interview if his name wasn't revealed. They sat in a quiet cafe, and Karl's son, now a 50-year-old man, began to speak. "I have good memories of my father, and that's what drives me crazy. He played with me, read me stories, carried me on his shoulders. How could the same man, the same father, have done those horrible things? Did you feel like you had two fathers? No, he was just one person, but he had two lives. One with us, one in that shop, and we knew nothing. Did your mother really not know anything? Karl's son shook his head. No, I'm sure. My mother was a simple woman, a housewife. If she had known, she would have gone crazy. How do you live with this reality now? Every day is hard. Every day when I look in the mirror, I see my father's face. Every day I'm afraid that maybe I'll become like him. That's why I never married, never had children. I didn't want to pass this curse on to the next generation. After months of research and interviews, Martin produced a comprehensive documentary. When the documentary aired, society was shocked again. Even after all these years, the story of Karl Denke still had the power to horrify. Some criticized Martin for reviving this story, for reopening old wounds, but he defended himself, saying, "We must not forget these stories. We must remember how monsters may live among us, how someone we see every day might actually be something else. This is a warning for all of us." The impact of Karl Denke on German society, especially on the city of Berlin, was deep and long-lasting. This wasn't just a criminal case. It was a psychological blow to the entire society. In the years following the revelation of Karl's crimes, the number of people seeking psychiatric help in Berlin increased dramatically. People who had shopped at Karl's store for years were now struggling with various psychological disorders: post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, severe anxiety, and even suicidal thoughts. A psychiatrist named Dr. Hans Berger, who worked with many of these patients during that period, wrote in his notes, "These patients were not direct victims of physical violence, but victims of a kind of psychological violence that is perhaps even deeper. They live with the thought that they may have unwittingly committed cannibalism, and this thought is slowly eating them away from the inside." Some of these patients never recovered. A woman named Frida, who had been a regular customer of Karl's for years, was eventually committed to a mental hospital. She had developed delusions, thinking she saw blood everywhere, that all food was human flesh. She remained in that hospital for the rest of her life, never returning to reality. Restaurants and butcher shops in Berlin also suffered. People had become suspicious. They could no longer buy meat with confidence. Meat sales in Berlin declined sharply for several years. Many butchers and restaurateurs who had no connection to Karl were forced to close their businesses. An old butcher named Karl, who coincidentally shared the same name as Karl Denke, was forced to change his name because customers would flee his shop when they heard his name. He said bitterly, "I carried this name with pride for 40 years, but now this name is forever tainted." The neighborhood where Karl's shop was located became known as Death Quarter. Housing prices there plummeted. People moved away, and gradually, the area became deserted. Years later, the city council had to implement extensive redevelopment programs to bring life back to that neighborhood. In schools, the story of Karl Denke became a kind of cautionary tale. Teachers used this story to teach children how to protect themselves from potential dangers. But these lessons were often delivered in a frightening and overly detailed way, causing children to have nightmares. One of those children, now a 60-year-old man, said in an interview with Martin, "I was 8 years old when our teacher told us the story of Karl Denke. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was scared. For years afterward, I was afraid of every stranger, thinking they might be like Karl." The trust between people decreased. Neighbors became suspicious of each other. People distanced themselves from strangers. The sense of security that previously existed in society disappeared. A sociologist named Dr. Gerhard Müller, no relation to the detective, wrote in research he conducted, "Karl Denke's crimes not only harmed his direct victims, but damaged the entire social fabric of Berlin. The social trust that had taken years to build collapsed in just a few days. But alongside all this damage, positive things also happened. Society began talking about things that had previously been silent. A social activist named Clara Schmidt, who later founded an organization to support street women, said, "I don't want the Karl Denke tragedy to remain just a scary story. I want us to learn from it. I want no one else to be as alone and vulnerable as Karl's victims were." The victims' families also began a kind of solidarity. They formed a group to support each other, to share their grief, to remember their loved ones. Martin attended one of these meetings, held years after Karl's execution. He saw how these people, each with their painful story, sat together and talked about their loved ones, not as victims, but as humans who had lived, laughed, loved. Greta's sister, Elsa, said at that meeting, "Greta loved spring flowers. Every spring, I buy a bouquet of spring flowers and bring them to the empty grave we made for her. And there, I talk to her, tell her what's happened in my life, tell her I still remember her, still love her." In later years, a memorial was built in Berlin for Karl Denke's victims and all victims of violence. A small garden with 23 trees, each for one of Karl's known victims. In the middle of the garden was a large stone with the names of all the victims engraved. On the day the memorial opened, hundreds of people came. Victims' families, city officials, ordinary people. Everyone came to remember, to commemorate, to promise they would not forget. The mayor of Berlin said in his speech, "This memorial is not only for Karl Denke's victims, but for all those who have been victims of violence and cruelty. We must remember that every life has value. Every human has the right to live with security and respect, and we must be vigilant that such tragedies are not repeated." But the question that remained unanswered was, could such a thing happen again? Could another monster like Karl Denke live among us without us noticing? The answer, unfortunately, was yes. In later years, other serial killers were discovered in Germany and elsewhere in the world. None were as horrific as Karl Denke, but they all had one thing in common. They too had managed to remain hidden in society, continuing their work for years without anyone noticing. This was a bitter reality, that society had to come to terms with. Monsters are real, and they have human form.